Good enemies are a core component to any successful action RPG, and the enemies from the Zelda series are some of the most iconic. It's about time I create some enemies for my own game, which of course is very much inspired by The Legend of Zelda. Before coding anything, I need to come up with a design. Something simple can still be very effective, just like Zelda's Octoroks. I was struggling to come up with something new, so I ended up borrowing an idea from myself. This eyeball enemy is from my mobile game Necrozone, but I think the design fits my Zelda-like game very nicely, so I'm going to be pulling this into the project. I went ahead and coded in a new enemy object type and spawned it into the game, with the same swaying animation from Necrozone. It looks a bit flat though, so I added some eyeshadow to help show that it's floating. To assist in this floating effect even more, I added some tweening to the Y position that we're drawing the eyeball, and this subtle bobbing up and down really adds a lot of life to the enemy. Next, I wanted to make it move. I made it so that if we're close enough, the enemy will begin accelerating towards the player, but with a cap on how fast it can go. The acceleration aspect is very important. That's what makes the movement so fluid, and when it changes direction, it veers off just a little bit because it maintains its momentum, which feels more realistic. This is what it looks like when it simply moves closer to the player every frame. It feels like it has no weight and it just doesn't look very natural. The acceleration and physics-based movement solves this problem entirely. Now our enemy is able to chase us, but we can't fight back. So I finally added a hitbox to the sword, and when this hitbox collides with the enemy, it gets knocked back a little bit and it takes some damage. Each enemy has a basic health value, and with each sword hit, that value gets decreased by 1. In order to better indicate that damage was taken, I put in a short red damage flash. Now to defeat the enemy, we need some way to remove it from the game once its health property reaches 0. I made this extra sprite that shows the eyeball looking more distressed, and once the enemy loses all of its health, it changes over to this new sprite and then fades away. This is a nice and simple death animation that does the job well, but I'll probably improve on this later on. Also, saying it just changed sprites is misleading. What actually happens is the enemy object is destroyed, but in its place it creates a new intangible effect that just has the distressed eyeball sprite. This makes the fading effect a lot easier to do, it removes the enemy hitbox while it's fading, and it gives me more flexibility to update how this looks later on. So we're now able to fight the enemy with the sword, but what about the other weapons? We currently have the bombs and the boomerang to work with. The bombs were easy since they already had the logic in place to blow up rocks. Feel free to watch that video for more information. I basically leveraged that same logic so that when the explosion hits an enemy, it gets pushed back and takes a lot of damage. Right now, it's doing 3 times as much damage as the sword, but this will certainly be balanced as the game progresses. Now for the boomerang. I don't actually want the boomerang to do damage. Instead, I want it to behave a lot like the boomerang from Zelda: Link to the Past, where it just stuns enemies for a short period of time. So when there's a collision, the enemy enters this stunned state, where its sprite changes to the distressed one and it stops moving. It'll stay like this for a couple seconds and then hop right back up. While it's down, that gives the player the opportunity to run in and slash it. And finally, this leads us to the last thing to do. What good is an enemy if it can't hurt the player? I showed in an earlier video the heart system that's in place, so all we need to do is make it so the player loses some health on collision. But more than just that, I added the same kind of knockback and red damage flash whenever an enemy hits the player. Finally, the enemies can get some revenge. You could say it's an eye for an eye. And on that note, we'll wrap up the video here. I'm very glad to have a full working enemy in the game, since this is what will make the gameplay interesting. In case you weren't aware, this whole project is completely open source and available on GitHub. You can find a link to the repo in the description. And if you enjoyed, please like the video. I really appreciate the support. If you'd like to see more videos like this or more game development content in general, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.